Hello everybody, I thought I would upload a video because I haven't uploaded a video for a long time and I didn't want anybody to wonder if anything had happened. So I'm still live and kicking, I just don't tend to upload videos for the sake of it. This video is a video response, or maybe I could say a video that's been inspired by a video on the Scottish Urban Prepper channel. Now, whilst it would be pushing it to describe me as a prepper, I certainly don't think of myself that way. The Scottish Urban Prepper channel is really interesting. All the videos on there are well worth a watch. I've found it very educational. I'll put a link to the channel in the video description down below, and I will also include a link directly to the video on there that has inspired me to make this video. Hello David, if you're watching. Now, in the last week or two, David posted a video to do with PMR446. Specifically, he was looking at some Retevis handheld radios that I don't own, so I can't talk about those specifically. But I noticed in the comments to that video and in comments on his live thread, several people said that basically they didn't know anything about PMR446. Now, I've been mucking about with it pretty much since it was introduced, so whilst I'm not a worldwide authority on PMR446, I thought I would do a video. This video is aimed very much at people who don't already have knowledge, so if you're already familiar with PMR446, you'll probably think that there are some generalisations and oversimplifications in this video, in which case it's probably not for you. Equally, it's unscripted and unrehearsed, and I'm going to try to do minimal editing. There probably will be some, probably because my camera battery will go flat halfway through, but I'm effectively doing this in pretty much one take. If I misspeak or leave out anything important, I will also include any corrections and additions in the notes below. I do tend to ramble, so this video might be quite long, so if you are allergic to long videos, then tune away now. So, PMR446. PMR stands for Personal Mobile Radio, as it says on the handheld there at the top that you might be able to see. Some people also refer to it as private mobile radio. Whatever the circumstances, transmissions you make using handhelds like these will not be private. Whatever the advertising or packaging tells you, the golden rule is if you wouldn't stand in the same spot where you're using one of these radios and shout whatever you were going to say through a megaphone, then don't say it on the air. The 446 is simply the frequency, 446 megahertz, in which these radios operate. So, a bit of history. PMR446 was introduced in the UK in April, I think it was, 1999. The regulator at that time introduced 8 channels, which live on today as channels 1 to 8. And at the time all transmissions were in FM as opposed to digital. It was a Europe-wide initiative, so those 8 channels could then and can still today be used anywhere in Europe. Or I say anywhere, I've got a feeling there might be one country down in the Balkans where you're not allowed to use it, but generally speaking, certainly in countries like France and Germany and Spain, you can use these 8 channels without a license, without needing any particular permission in particular, but the service runs on a non-protection basis. So if you use these, you have to accept that other people may be using the channels as well. They may, hopefully inadvertently, cause you interference If that happens, then you have no protection and no comeback. And sometimes you might find that if you use a particular channel, then a local company that's been using that channel for years will come up and tell you to go away, more or less politely, because you are on their channel, quote unquote. If that happens, tough basically. If they want exclusive use of a channel, then they should pay a license fee each year and have one assigned to them by the regulator. PMR446 may be used for any purpose. You can use it in connection with a business, you can use it for leisure, you can use it for whatever you want, with the rather obvious exception that if you were using it for illegal purposes, like coordinating a crime, for example, then I think the authorities would take a dim view of that. So back to the history. Channels 1 to 8 were introduced in 1999. The specification is that these handhelds can put out up to half a watt, 500 milliwatts effective radiated power. That is a very, very small amount of power. The antennas tend to be not massively efficient, so the result is that the coverage you will get from these will be at best limited and at worst limited in the extreme. However, there are advantages to that. Number one, because these run on low power, producing usually localized transmissions, it means that the channels can be reused up and down the country in quite close proximity. I could be talking to somebody in my village on channel 3, for example. Two other people could be talking to each other on channel 3 in the next village 2 or 3 miles away, and we wouldn't interfere with each other. Second advantage is that because it's low power, batteries do tend to last quite a long time. If this was putting out 5 watts instead of half a watt, then the life of the batteries inside would decrease significantly, and if you didn't put a better antenna on top, and once we get into the realms of modifying radios and putting better antennas on, then that becomes illegal and it's outside of the scope of this video. But if you put more power into an antenna like that anyway, all that would happen is the batteries would go flat much quicker and the radio would get a lot hotter. Your range might increase a bit, but not massively. Basically, low power is not the massive disadvantage that it might seem. And number 3, if your comms are private and you don't want the whole world overhearing, then a lower power will mean a lower coverage area, so a smaller coverage area rather. So as long as the person you want to talk to is in range, then that could actually be an advantage in terms of other people not overhearing you. So wind the clock forward, and in I think about 2004, Ofcom, as the regulator then was in the UK, introduced 8 more channels that exist today as channels 9 to 16. For quite a few years after that, the rule was that the original channels 1 to 8 could only be used for FM, and channels 9 to 16 could only be used for digital PMR. Now, at first sight, the rationale there is sound, because analog users and digital users could quite conceivably interfere with each other without one ever knowing that the other was there. The only drawback was that only one equipment manufacturer, ICOM I think it was, ever produced a digital PMR radio, so you had the rather ridiculous situation that if you went into the middle of a city centre, you could have channels 1 to 8 absolutely rammed with lots of users all causing interference to each other, and channels 9 to 16 completely empty and silent. So a few years ago, Ofcom took the sensible decision to say, okay, all 16 channels are up for grabs. You can use analog or digital on any one of the 16. Now, David said in one of his videos that all PMR radios can talk to all other PMR radios. You don't need the manufacturer or the brand to be the same. That is true, with the one caveat that if you are transmitting on channels 9 to 16, the person you're talking to must have a radio that is also capable of covering channels 9 to 16 in order to receive you. If they're using a radio that only covers channels 1 to 8, and remember there's about 20 years worth of manufacture of radios that only cover channels 1 to 8, then they will not be able to hear you if you stay on channels 9 to 16. But apart from that, any PMR446 radio can talk to any other PMR446 radio that's in range. The upper channels, 9 to 16, seem to get busier with every passing year. However, in the 3, 4, 5 years since they were legalised for FM, however long ago it was, whilst activity has increased, even in 2022, the upper channels 9 to 16 are still far, far quieter than the original channels 1 to 8. So if you were talking to somebody and wanted a bit more privacy, privacy being a relative term, then you might want to choose channels 9 to 16 rather than channels 1 to 8. Talking about privacy and the opposite of that, if we were in a situation where you needed to call for help, PMR446 is not routinely monitored by anybody, and because of the low power you would have to be quite close, but there is an accepted convention that channel 8 is the calling channel, quote unquote. So if you needed to try to summon help by putting out a random call and hoping that somebody heard you, then channel 8 would be the channel to try first. There's also this thing called the Wilderness Protocol, which I think is more of a thing in the States than in the UK, whereby if you need to summon help, you transmit for the first 3 minutes every 3 hours on the hour. So at midday, 3 PM, 6 PM, 9 PM and so on, and other people monitor at those times, and that way you save battery power. And the convention there is that you do it on channel 3 of whatever system that you're using. So in the case of PMR446, it would be channel 3 for 3 minutes on the hour every 3 hours. But like I say, I think that's more of a thing in the States than in the UK. Now range, let's talk about range. If you buy PMR446 radios in like a blister pack with advertising on it about the fantastic range you'll have, you might see ranges in miles or tens of miles sometimes. If one or both of you are standing on a hill, then a range of 10 plus miles is certainly realistic. If you are both in a built-up city centre, you might be lucky to scrape a quarter of a mile. It all depends on the geography and to a lesser extent on how fully charged or how flat your batteries are, I guess. 446 megahertz is UHF, which is ultra high frequency, which is usually line of sight plus a bit. That is taken as the general convention. It can work well in city centres because the wavelength is short enough that it is capable of bouncing and reflecting off things. For example, when we used to have a gasometer in Worthing, on a nearby amateur radio band, 70 centimetres, that is close enough in frequency it behaves the same way as 446, I was able to talk to somebody over a very obstructed path. There was a hill in the way, but we had clear communications because the gasometer was capable of bouncing the signals off it. Since they removed or deflated that thing a few years ago, I can now barely hear him at all. So you're not going to get mega range, even if you and the person you're talking to are on the tops of mountains. You aren't going to have coverage spanning hundreds of miles unless there are freak atmospheric conditions, and those happen so rarely that for the purposes of this video we might just as well completely disregard them and not worry about them. And of course the other thing to bear in mind is that even if the person you are speaking to is only a couple of roads away, you may very well not be able to talk to them because somebody else using the same channel nearby will completely block them out. FM, frequency modulation, has what's called the capture effect. If two people in range of you both transmit on the same channel at the same time, you will only hear one or the other. You'll hear distortion behind them. You'll probably be aware that somebody else is transmitting at the same time, but in terms of what is actually being said, you will only hear one or the other. So as I mentioned, 500 milliwatts is flea power, but it can go surprisingly far. Using just these, I can sometimes hear people, and based on what they're saying, even though I don't know exactly where they are, they can't be just down the road from me. So say you've got a friend in the next village and who you would want to stay in touch with if the mobile network went down. Even if you think that there's absolutely no point even trying it because you'll be too far away from each other, try it anyway and you might actually be surprised. Now, on the subject of power, most PMR446 radios use AA or AAA batteries, either 3 or 4 of them. Every handset I have ever used has been just as happy running from rechargeable batteries, nickel metal hydride, as they have been running from alkaline batteries. And the reason I mention those two is that there's a slight voltage difference, 1.2 volts when fully charged versus 1.5 volts for a fresh non-reusable alkaline cell-ish. David mentioned also that some radios have flashlights built into the top of them, which is true. If yours has a flashlight built in, just be careful, because some radios will allow the flashlight to function even when the radio itself is switched off. The most recent and notorious example of that is the Florian FC200, which is available once again on eBay now after it disappeared for a while. And even though the radio is switched off, as you will see, if I press the lamp button, it comes on. You would not believe how easy it is, if you've got this radio in a carrier bag or your coat pocket, for that button to get pressed. So what I do, and I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but what I do is when the radio isn't in use and I've got it in my pocket, I just take one of the 3 AA batteries out and turn it the other way round. I don't know if that's really advisable or not, but at least it means that the whole thing isn't flat when I've come to use it because the light has accidentally been switched on. There are mods you can do with this, but most of them involve disabling the light altogether. And whilst this wouldn't be my first choice of flashlight, I think I wouldn't want to stop the bulb working altogether just in case the day ever arrived when I was relying on it to work. So where can you get PMR446 radios? Well, you can buy them in the shop sometimes. Lidl sells them occasionally. You can buy them online. You can actually buy them at car boot sales. This little one here, I think cost me 50p at a car boot sale. Takes 3 AAA batteries, this one, and the antenna is so short compared to the antenna on there that I probably only get a couple of 100 milliwatts out of this, so even less power. But sometimes you can cut a good bargain at car boot sales, especially if they've only got one radio, and especially if it doesn't have batteries in it, so you can't see it working. If you can get one for £1 or £2, then it's worth taking a punt, because the only thing wrong with it could be that the batteries that are in there are flat, and if they're rechargeables and you charge them up, you've then got yourself a set of rechargeable batteries that doubtlessly cost more than the radio does. And also, if the seller is only selling one, then when you're bartering the price, you could always say, well, what's one on its own? How's that any good? You know, I need a pair, really, to buy them off you. So how about 50p rather than £2? You know, that kind of thing. If you do buy radios at car boot sales or off eBay, just be very, very careful to ensure that they genuinely are PMR446 radios. In the States and in Canada, there is an equivalent thing called the FRS, the Family Radio Service. It's not exactly identical because they can use slightly higher power these days and there are more channels, but broadly speaking it's the same, and it operates on similar frequencies, 462 and 467 megahertz, so the radios physically will look very similar to legit PMR446 radios. If you buy one of those, obviously they will physically work in the UK, but they wouldn't be legal to use at the best of times, and worse, if we were in a something hits the fan situation and you are talking to somebody with possibly more sensitive topics than you would want to say over normal PMR446 radio anyway, then a surefire way to make your transmission stick out by a mile and to draw attention to yourself is to be operating on frequencies in the UK that you shouldn't be operating on. So from a discretion point of view, if not indeed a legal one, make absolutely sure that you are genuinely using PMR446 radios. The next thing I'll mention is privacy, or the lack of. As I've already mentioned, if you transmit using these, assume that other people will be listening. Radio enthusiasts may have large antennas, which it wouldn't be legal for them to transmit through, but in terms of reception, if somebody on a hill with a decent sized receive antenna started listening to the 16 channels, then potentially they could hear you from miles and miles and miles away. So assume zero privacy. Some of the more upmarket expensive radios will have a scrambler function included with them. I'm talking about analog radios here. If they do, that is likely to be a thing called voice inversion. Elsewhere on this channel there is a video of voice inversion, what it sounds like. They tend to use it at Lidl in the UK. Whilst that will put off the most casual of casual listeners, anybody who is half determined to listen into you will be able to defeat that. Some radios have a descrambler built in. There is freeware software that has been around for decades that will decode it very, very easily. So if you've got voice inversion, yes, it's a nice little extra level of defence, but it will only put off all but the most casual eavesdroppers who come across your signal. Worse than that are privacy codes, quote unquote. Some manufacturers will tell you that their radios have privacy codes. Other manufacturers will tell you that there are dozens or hundreds of channels to choose from. They don't, and there aren't. There are only ever 16, well it was 8 originally, but 16 channels laterally for people to play with. The privacy code is what is technically known as CTCSS, continuous tone coded sub-squelch, I think. And all that means is that if you switch it on, when you transmit, your radio adds a very low pitched tone that's so low you can't hear it, and the radio at the other end receiving filters it out. That is all it is. Now from that description you can see that that offers you no privacy at all. So how might it be useful? Well, here's a little thought experiment. Imagine you have an office with an overall manager and 2 teams, Team A and Team B. Those 2 teams are completely separate from one another. They all use PMR446 and they all decide to be on the same channel. So as things stand, let's just pick channel 3, completely out of thin air. As things stand, if anybody transmits on channel 3, everybody will hear everybody else. Now let's say Team A picks a privacy code, let's call it code 01 for argument's sake, and Team 2 chooses code 02. Nothing changes at this stage. If anybody transmits, everybody else within range will be able to hear them. Now, on receive, everybody on Team A who are transmitting with code 01 puts code 01 on receive, and everybody in Team 2 who is transmitting with tone 2 puts tone 2 on receive as well. Now, if somebody in Team A transmits, everybody else in Team A will hear them, but nobody in Team B will, and vice versa. However, the manager, with overall responsibility for both teams, if he or she puts no code on receive at all, they will hear everything. So really all the privacy codes are a way of keeping users on the same channel separate from each other. It offers no privacy in terms of the content or people being able to listen to what is being said. One major drawback with privacy tones, CTCSS, is that if you have a code on receive and you transmit, you won't hear anybody else local to you who is also transmitting at the same time. Radios with a different code will physically receive the signal. There may even be a light come on to let you know that it's receiving a signal, and some of the more expensive ones will have a thing called BCL, Busy Channel Lockout, that will stop you transmitting if there's somebody else on the channel who you can't hear. But in any given geographical area, only one person can be transmitting at once, because as I said earlier, with the FM capture effect, the strongest signal will win through. So one major drawback of CTCSS privacy codes is that you could cause massive interference to other people who you won't even know are there. It's quite hard. Once you understand how it works, it's a simple concept, but explaining it in a simple way is not necessarily easy. So I know that was quite a long and rambly explanation, and I hope it made sense. But the big thing to take away from all of this is that as far as privacy goes on PMR446, there is absolutely none, so don't rely on it. Scrambling is legal. As far as DMR, Digital PMR, is concerned. I've never actually owned a radio that will do it. You may be able to encrypt it to a more secure level, but even if you can, don't rely on it. I think if you were discussing really sensitive stuff, you would do better, rather than trying to encrypt the signal itself, you would do better to transmit in the clear, but use pre-arranged, predefined code words or phrases, something like that. So I think I've told you everything I can think of, so thank you for sitting through this marathon, and if I think of anything else that I should have mentioned, I will tack it on to the end of this video, but I hope it's been helpful. Oh yes, other thing I will mention, although the original 8 channels was a Europe-wide allocation, channels 9 to 16 were authorised by Ofcom for use in the UK. So whilst I'm not saying that you can't use channels 9 to 16 abroad, if you're going abroad and planning on using them, when I say abroad I mean into continental Europe, if you're thinking of using channels 9 to 16, then make absolutely sure that it's permissible in the particular country you're going into to use analogue on those frequencies. And going the other way, 446 megahertz in the US is slap bang in the middle of the 70 centimetre amateur radio band out there. So following on from what I said earlier about discretion and your transmission sticking out a mile if you're on a frequency that you shouldn't be on in the UK, the reverse is also true. If I took this to the US and transmitted on it, then my transmissions would stick out a mile for exactly the same reasons. One final comment, it might be worth avoiding channel 1 all the time, because most radios, when you turn them on, defaults to channel 1, so you'll get a lot of activity on that channel, particularly around Christmas, when lots of people have been given PMR446 radios as a present, and quite often in the couple of weeks following Christmas, channel 1 in particular will be very busy until either the batteries go flat or the novelty wears off. And just out of interest, I'm transmitting this message through the little 50p walkie-talkie that I bought at a car boot sale. And if you're watching this outside of the UK and Europe and in the States, then everything that I've said will apply equally to the family radio service with the little 500 milliwatts or 2-watt handsets you can get out there legally for the FRS. My battery went flat! And make sure your batteries are charged, that's another piece of advice, because you don't want them going flat just when you need them most. Yeah, so if you are outside of Europe and using FRS handhelds like these, everything that I said about range, privacy codes, quote unquote, which is a totally misleading name because there's no privacy involved at all of that stuff will apply just the same. Hope this video has been helpful.